When I first heard about the job, it seemed too good to be true. An easy night shift at a niche museum and decent pay for just watching over a bunch of dusty artifacts. The place was known as the Museum of Cursed Relics, which sounded like a bad marketing gimmick, but I didn't care. I needed the money. On my first night, the supervisor, a wiry man named Paul, handed me the keys and a single sheet of paper with rules typed in bold at the top. He stared at me, dead serious, and said, "Follow these exactly, or you'll regret it." The rules were bizarre. No looking into the mirror in Hall 3. Ignore any noises coming from the sarcophagus in the Egyptian gallery. Shut down all cameras for exactly 2 minutes at 3:33 a.m., no exceptions. At first, I thought it was some kind of initiation prank, but Paul's tone left no room for jokes. The first night felt strange, but uneventful. I walked through the dimly lit halls, my flashlight picking up glints of ancient masks, rusted weapons, and eerie dolls locked in their glass cases. The museum was silent except for the occasional hum of the air conditioner. Still, something about the atmosphere felt heavy, like the air itself was pressing down on me. Around 1 a.m., I passed the Egyptian gallery and felt an unexpected warmth radiating from the sarcophagus. I brushed it off as a faulty vent nearby. Later in Hall 3, I spotted the mirror they warned about. It was an ornate, oval thing positioned slightly askew against the wall, facing nothing in particular. I didn't dare look into it. My shift ended without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the museum was watching me, not the other way around. The second night started off quiet, just like the first. I was more relaxed this time, thinking maybe Paul had overplayed the whole rules thing. I stuck to the routine, making rounds, checking locks, and logging any anomalies. But around 2 a.m., I noticed something odd. In the Egyptian gallery, the sarcophagus looked off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but then I realized it had shifted slightly. It wasn't aligned with the markings on the floor like it had been the night before. I stared at it, trying to remember if I'd bumped into it during my rounds earlier, but that warmth I felt last night was back. Only now it was more intense. Almost like the thing was breathing heat. A soft, rhythmic sound began, like a faint tapping. I froze, remembering the rule. Ignore any noises coming from the sarcophagus. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to walk away, even though every instinct screamed at me to check inside. Back at the security office, I tried distracting myself by reviewing the camera feeds. Most of the screens showed empty halls, dimly lit displays, and still shadows. But Hall 3 was different. The mirror, no, something near the mirror, caught my eye. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, but then I saw it. A faint silhouette, barely visible, standing in the corner of the room. It wasn't moving, just standing there motionless, facing the wall. I zoomed in, but the resolution made it hard to make out any details. My stomach dropped as I realized I hadn't passed anyone during my rounds, and no one else was supposed to be here. I grabbed the radio to call Paul, but stopped myself. What was I even going to say? Instead, I double-checked the office door lock and turned off the lights, hoping the night would end soon. The third night was when things spiraled out of control. By then, I was jittery just walking into the place. The air inside the museum felt thicker, like stepping into a room where something terrible had just happened. I started my rounds as usual, gripping the flashlight, so hard my knuckles turned white. Everything was fine until I reached Hall 3. The mirror, which had been leaning against the wall the first 2 nights, was now propped upright, facing directly toward the center of the room. I didn't touch it. Hell, I didn't even breathe near it. My instinct screamed to get out of there, but the rules echoed in my head. Don't look into the mirror. I kept my eyes low and moved on, my footsteps quickening as I distanced myself from that cursed thing. By 3 a.m., I was back in the office, trying to convince myself that I was overthinking everything. Maybe the cleaning crew adjusted the mirror during the day. Maybe I'd misremembered its position. But then the cameras flickered. It started as static, just for a second before the feed returned. I leaned in to check Hall 3 again, and that's when I saw it. The mirror wasn't just facing the center of the room anymore. It was tilted toward the camera, almost as if it was looking at me. My chest tightened. Against every shred of common sense, I stared at the screen, squinting to make out the faint movement in the reflection. That's when I saw it. A shadow in the mirror. It wasn't mine. My reflection was sitting in the office chair, perfectly still, but the shadow in the mirror moved, slowly creeping toward the glass as if it knew I was watching. I must have stared at that screen for too long, because the next thing I remember was the lights flickering violently. The entire museum plunged into darkness for a few seconds before the emergency lights kicked in, casting everything in a sickly, pulsating red glow. My radio crackled, startling me, but no one spoke. Just static. Then faintly through the intercom I heard it, a voice, raspy and distorted, barely more than a whisper. "You broke the rule." My blood ran cold. I fumbled with the office door lock, making sure it was secure, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely think straight. The cameras blinked back to life, and that's when I saw it. Soleo 3 wasn't empty anymore. The figure was back, but this time it wasn't just a shadow in the mirror. It was standing in the middle of the room, motionless, facing away from the camera. It had no features, no face, no eyes, just a vaguely human outline shrouded in darkness. The way it stood there completely still made my skin crawl. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Then it started to turn, slowly, deliberately, as if it knew I was watching. Just as its head was about to face the camera, the feed cut to static again. I bolted upright, my chair screeching against the floor. The intercom crackled back to life, and this time, the voice was louder. "Leave." My heart felt like it would explode. I didn't know if it was a warning or a threat, but I wasn't going to wait around to find out. I grabbed my keys and ran for the main exit, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. Every shadow felt alive, stretching toward me as I passed. When I reached the front doors, my stomach sank. They wouldn't budge. The deadbolt was locked, even though I knew I hadn't touched it since starting my shift. I fumbled with the keys, trying each one in a panic, but none of them worked. My hands were slick with sweat, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. That's when the tapping started again. It wasn't coming from the Egyptian gallery this time. It was closer, much closer. The sound echoed down the hallway behind me, deliberate and slow, like someone dragging their fingers along the walls. I forced myself to turn around, scanning the hallway with my flashlight. It barely pierced the darkness, but something moved just out of reach of the beam. A shadow, low to the ground, slithering across the floor. My breath caught as it darted into the doorway of Hall 3. I didn't want to follow it, but the tapping grew louder, almost demanding, and my legs felt like they were moving on their own. As I approached the hall, the temperature dropped sharply, my breath forming clouds in the air. The mirror was there, fully upright, but now it reflected something impossible. The entire room was filled with figures, all faceless, all staring at the mirror from the edges of the frame. My own reflection stood in the center, but it wasn't mirroring my movements anymore. It turned its head to face me, tilting slightly, as if inviting me to step closer. I don't know what possessed me to step into Hall 3, but it felt like I didn't have a choice. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and each step echoed unnaturally, like the room itself was amplifying the sound. The figures in the mirror didn't move, but I could feel their attention shift toward me. It was a silent, crushing sensation, like being watched by hundreds of unseen eyes. I stopped a few feet away from the mirror, my reflection still staring back, but its movements weren't syncing with mine anymore. It raised a hand, slowly pointing at something behind me. My blood ran cold. I wanted to turn around, but my body refused to move. Then I felt it, a presence, ice cold and towering, directly behind me. My flashlight flickered, casting distorted shadows on the walls, but I couldn't bring myself to look. The mirror's reflection showed only emptiness where I stood, no shadow, no figure. But the voice came again, this time from all directions, reverberating through my skull. "It's your turn now." My reflection's face began to change, features warping and twisting into something unrecognizable. Its mouth opened, and I swear I saw rows of jagged teeth before the glass shattered without warning. The sound was deafening, and shards flew everywhere, yet not a single piece touched me. The figures in the reflection disappeared, leaving only an empty frame behind. The sound of the shattering glass seemed to echo endlessly, but the silence that followed was worse. My flashlight gave out completely, plunging the hall into darkness. I fumbled with my phone, trying to use its screen for light, but the tapping started again, this time faster, frantic, like it was rushing toward me. I bolted out of Hall 3, nearly tripping over my own feet, and sprinted back to the security office, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked it and collapsed into the chair, gasping for air. The monitors flickered back on, and for a moment, I thought I was safe. But then I saw the feeds. Every single camera was focused on me, broadcasting the security office from every possible angle. I stared in horror as a new feed appeared, one I didn't recognize. It was a close-up of the small box sitting on my desk, the one I'd barely noticed earlier. It hadn't been there when I started my shift. The box was old, wooden, with a strange, swirling symbol carved into the lid. On the monitor, I watched my own trembling hand reach for it, but in reality, I wasn't moving. My body stayed frozen in the chair, even as the cameras showed me opening the box. The moment the lid lifted on screen, a sharp, piercing sound exploded from the intercom. It wasn't just noise. It was a voice distorted and filled with static, screaming a single word, "Stay." I slammed the monitor off, but the piercing sound didn't stop. It was everywhere now, rattling through the walls and vibrating the air around me. I clutched my ears, trying to block it out, but the intercom crackled again, softer this time, almost like a whisper. "You can't leave," it said. The door to the office creaked, and my stomach dropped. The lock I had double-checked minutes ago was slowly turning on its own. I shot up from the chair, backing into the corner of the room as the door creaked open. The hallway beyond was pitch black, but something moved just out of sight, a faint shuffle, like bare feet on the cold floor. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. The figure stepped into the doorway, silhouetted against the faint red glow of the emergency lights. It was tall, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs and a head that tilted unnaturally to one side. No face, no eyes, just that awful, blank void where its features should have been. My breath hitched as it began to step into the room, slow and deliberate. But then it stopped, its head snapping toward the desk. The box. The figure seemed to shudder, almost as if in recognition, and then it turned back to me. I don't know what came over me, maybe pure instinct, but I lunged for the box, slamming the lid shut as hard as I could. The moment it closed, the figure vanished, like smoke dissipating in the air. For a moment, I thought it was over. The room was deathly silent, the air still, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I stared at the box, now back on the desk, its symbol glowing faintly like it was alive. I didn't dare touch it again. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that cursed place as possible. But when I turned toward the monitors, my stomach dropped. Every screen was showing the same thing me. Not me in the security office, but me walking through the museum, aimlessly wandering the halls with a blank, lifeless expression. My reflection wasn't just in one place. It was everywhere. Every camera feed showed me moving through different rooms simultaneously, as if there were dozens of versions of me, all silently roaming the museum. Then the intercom crackled one last time. The voice was faint, almost like it was inside my head, and it simply said, "It's your turn to stay." The lights flickered, and the screens all went black. When they came back on, the feeds were empty. No artifacts, no figures, no me, just empty hallways and dark rooms. My legs gave out, and I sank to the floor, staring at the door, half expecting that faceless thing to return. But it never did. At least, not while I was awake. I must have passed out, because the next thing I remember was waking up to the morning crew banging on the door. I didn't explain anything. I didn't even collect my paycheck. I just walked out, leaving the keys and that curse box behind. To this day, I don't know what I saw or why it chose me. But every now and then, I dream of the museum, of the halls and the tapping. And when I wake up, I swear I can feel that same suffocating presence watching, waiting.